There are houses where time stands still, where walls remember more than the people who live inside them. On a quiet street in Amityville, New York, sits one such house, 112 Ocean Avenue. To some, it's just an old Dutch colonial with a white facade and those strange quarter-moon windows staring like empty eyes. But to the Lutz family, it became a nightmare they would never forget. This is their story, the chilling, true account of the Amityville Horror. The air was crisp that December afternoon in 1975 when George and Kathy Lutz first stepped into the house with their 3 children. George, a stocky man in his mid-30s with a neatly trimmed beard, felt a rush of pride as he took in the spacious rooms. The deal had been too good to pass up. $80,000 for a 5-bedroom waterfront property in Long Island was unheard of. There was only one catch, the real estate agent had warned. A year earlier, the house had been the scene of a brutal mass murder. On November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had taken a rifle and murdered his parents and 4 siblings as they slept. No one could explain why he did it. No signs of struggle, no neighbors hearing screams, just 6 bodies, each shot in their beds. The house had been empty ever since. Kathy, a warm and caring woman with long auburn hair, brushed off the warnings. She was a devout Catholic, and she believed in blessing a home before settling in. "Whatever happened here before," she told George, "it can't hurt us." The first days in the house were calm. The kids, Daniel, Christopher, and little Missy, explored their new bedrooms, and George busied himself with unpacking and setting up his office. But almost immediately, there were subtle signs that something wasn't right. The air inside seemed colder than it should be, even with the heat running. George couldn't shake a constant chill, wrapping himself in blankets and tending the fireplace obsessively. At night, he began waking at exactly 3:15 a.m., the same time the DeFeo murders had occurred. He would find himself staring out the window toward the boathouse without knowing why. Kathy started having vivid nightmares. She dreamed of the murders in unsettling detail, the order in which the DeFeo family had been killed, the sounds of footsteps in the hallway, the stifled cries. She woke each morning drenched in sweat, her heart racing. One afternoon, Kathy was unpacking boxes in the sewing room when she felt an icy presence behind her. She turned, expecting to see George, but the doorway was empty. Then, from the corner of the room, came a soft whisper, her name drawn out and almost loving. "Kathy?" Missy, the youngest, began speaking to an imaginary friend she called Jody. When Kathy asked what Jody looked like, Missy smiled and said, "She's a big pig, but she can change shapes. Sometimes she's an angel." Kathy dismissed it as a child's imagination, but when she went to check on Missy one night, she saw 2 glowing red eyes staring at her from the window on the 2nd floor. When she rushed to the glass, there was nothing outside but the cold, dark yard. The family priest, Father Mancuso, came to bless the house. As he moved from room to room, sprinkling holy water, he entered one upstairs bedroom and stopped cold. A sudden wave of nausea washed over him, and his hands began to tremble. From behind, a voice, loud, guttural, and filled with rage, shouted, "Get out!" He stumbled from the room, his face pale, and told Kathy quietly, "Don't use that room. Ever." Over the following days, strange phenomena escalated. Doors slammed on their own. Foul odors, like rotting meat, would fill certain areas and vanish just as quickly. Swarms of flies appeared in the middle of winter, clinging to the walls and buzzing furiously. George's temper grew short, and he became distant, spending hours staring into the fire. On the 13th day, George woke again at 3:15 a.m., but this time he heard the sound of a marching band downstairs. He crept to the living room, and as he turned the corner, the music stopped abruptly. All the furniture was rearranged. Kathy, too, was changing. She found herself feeling drained, unable to focus on the simplest tasks. She began seeing shadowy figures moving in her peripheral vision. One night, she awoke to see George standing over her, axe in hand, his face blank. When she screamed, he blinked and looked confused, dropping the axe to the floor. He swore he had no memory of picking it up. The days in the house seemed to blur together for the Lutz family. Time felt distorted, as though the house itself dictated the hours. George's behavior worsened. He stopped going to work, unshaven and hollow-eyed, fixated on chopping firewood and keeping the fireplace burning at all times. The children whispered about how Daddy didn't smile anymore. Kathy's health began to deteriorate. She developed dark circles under her eyes, her skin pale and clammy. At night, she woke screaming from dreams of a faceless woman in a long white gown who hovered at the foot of her bed. The woman's mouth would open impossibly wide, and from it would pour black smoke that seemed to choke the room. The entity known as Jody became more present. Missy often sat in her room giggling and talking to the invisible friend. Once, Kathy overheard her daughter saying, "I can't tell them our secret." When pressed, Missy only smiled and said Jody told her not to. That night, as George locked the doors, he glanced outside and froze. In the snow by the boathouse were large cloven hoofprints leading away into the darkness. Father Mancuso attempted to return, but each time he tried to drive to the house, his car broke down. He suffered sudden fevers, blisters on his hands, and violent nausea. On the phone with George one evening, static filled the line, followed by a deep, unearthly voice that growled, "You will die." The connection cut, leaving George staring at the receiver in silence. The physical disturbances became undeniable. Doors were ripped from hinges, windows slammed shut with such force they shattered, and an unseen force seemed to stalk the halls at night. One evening, Kathy was in the kitchen when she heard the front door creak open. She rushed to close it, but the hallway was empty, except for the stench of decay that made her gag. One of the most terrifying nights came in late December. George awoke at 3:15 a.m. to the sound of drums and chanting. He crept downstairs, and the living room was filled with a shadowy congregation. Hooded figures swaying in rhythm, their faces hidden. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur. As he stepped forward, they vanished instantly, leaving only the echo of chanting in his ears. That same night, Kathy experienced something far worse. She had fallen asleep in the bedroom when she felt an intense pressure on her chest, as though something were sitting on her. She opened her eyes and saw a demonic face inches from hers. A twisted parody of a pig's head, eyes glowing red, mouth grinning with jagged teeth. She couldn't move or scream until the pressure lifted, and the room was empty once more. George became obsessed with the history of the property. Digging through old records, he discovered that before the DeFeos, the land had been used by the Shinnecock Indians as a burial ground for the sick and insane. Worse still, a local legend told of a man named John Ketchum, a devil worshipper who fled Salem and built a home on the land in the 1600s, performing rituals and sacrifices. George began to believe the house was built over something ancient and evil, a gateway that could not be closed. Missy's behavior took a disturbing turn. She told Kathy that Jody wanted the family to stay forever and ever, and when asked what would happen if they left, Missy replied matter-of-factly, "Then you'll all be hurt." That evening, Kathy found the crucifix she had hung in the living room turned upside down, its metal surface blackened as if burned. By the third week, the family was at their breaking point. The temperature inside the house fluctuated wildly. One room would be freezing while another was unbearably hot. Slime-like green ooze began to seep from the walls and door frames. The stench was so overpowering that the children refused to enter certain rooms. One night, George heard loud banging from the basement. Grabbing a flashlight, he descended the stairs, but the light flickered and went out. In the darkness, he felt something brush past him, large, cold, and wet. Then, just for a second, he saw two glowing red eyes staring at him from the far corner before they blinked out. Kathy begged George to leave, but he insisted they couldn't just abandon their home. Yet, deep down, he felt the house was wearing him down, stripping away his will to fight. The thought of leaving was somehow repulsive, as though the house had planted the idea that leaving would be dangerous. But the house wasn't done with them yet. The final days inside 112 Ocean Avenue would etch themselves into the Lutz family's memories like scars. By January 1976, less than a month after moving in, the activity in the house had reached a fever pitch. George was no longer the man Kathy had married. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, his beard unkempt. He spoke less, often answering questions with a grunt or not at all. When he did speak, it was in short bursts, often muttering under his breath words Kathy couldn't understand. He had stopped eating, existing instead on black coffee, and still, the cold that gripped him never left. The children began waking in the night, screaming about monsters in their rooms. Daniel claimed a faceless man had been standing over his bed, while Christopher swore something had yanked the blankets off him. Missy's imaginary friend Jody now appeared to her even in daylight. Visible, she insisted, sitting in the rocking chair by her window. One afternoon, Kathy entered Missy's room and saw the chair moving on its own, the faint sound of a child's laughter drifting through the air. The slime from the walls became more aggressive. It oozed down the staircase, pooling on the floor, sticky and foul-smelling. No matter how many times George cleaned it, it reappeared, spreading like an infection through the house. The nights were the worst. On January 12th, George awoke to the deafening sound of a marching band in the living room, the blare of brass instruments, the pounding of drums. He raced downstairs, but the room was empty. As he stood in the center of the living room, the sound returned, but this time it was all around him, impossibly loud. He clamped his hands over his ears, and in that instant, the front door blew open with such force it cracked the frame. Kathy began experiencing physical attacks. One morning, she awoke with deep red welts across her chest, as though clawed by something unseen. Another night, she claimed she was lifted from the bed and slammed against the wall, unable to breathe. Her once gentle demeanor was now overshadowed by fear and exhaustion. George, too, began having visions. He would glance at Kathy and for a split second see her face transform, her eyes bulging, her mouth twisted in a snarl, her skin cracked and gray. He never told her, but the image haunted him. By the end of January, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. The family stopped sleeping, huddling together in one room with the lights on, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house that seemed to breathe around them. The air was thick, oppressive, almost alive. The final night came without warning. It was January 14th, 1976. A winter storm raged outside, wind howling through the trees. snow slashing against the windows. George woke at 3:15 a.m., as usual, but this time, the house was alive with chaos. Doors slammed open and shut upstairs. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. From the basement came a deep, guttural roar that shook the floorboards. Kathy screamed from the bedroom and George ran to her. She was levitating above the bed, her hair whipping around her face, her eyes wide with terror. The children were crying, their voices barely audible over the noise that filled the house, a cacophony of whispers, growls, and something that sounded like 1,000 buzzing insects. George grabbed the kids and yelled for Kathy to move. They ran down the stairs, the temperature dropping with each step, their breath visible in the air. From the kitchen, the smell of sulfur grew overwhelming, making them gag. As they reached the front door, George saw it. Standing in the doorway to the living room was a towering, shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing, eyes glowing red. The air seemed to vibrate around it. For a moment, George was frozen, his body refusing to move. Then, with a final surge of will, he shoved the door open and forced the family out into the blizzard. They didn't stop to grab belongings. They didn't look back. George drove through the storm, not caring where they ended up, only that they were far from 112 Ocean Avenue. The next morning, they returned briefly with friends to collect what they could. Inside, the house was eerily silent, the chaos of the night before erased. But the smell, that thick, rotting stench, still clung to the air, and none of them stayed longer than a few minutes. The Lutz family never lived in the house again. They left Amityville behind, but the nightmares followed them for years. Whatever lived in that house had marked them, and no amount of distance could erase the memory of what they'd endured. Some call it a hoax. Others believe it to be one of the most documented hauntings in history. Skeptics argue, believers warn. But one thing remains. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue still stands, its quarter-moon windows staring out at the quiet street, as if waiting for the next family to open its door. And if you ever find yourself in Amityville, you might wonder, if the walls could speak, what horrors would they tell?